Okay, it's a couple minutes after the hour, so let's get started. So welcome to this webinar offering some perspectives from authors from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report. I'm Greg Nemeth, a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in this webinar, we're going to have three panelists who are all IPCC authors from the Sixth Assessment Report. They will each speak on their experience as authors. We'll cover the process of drafting the reports. We'll also speak about the review and approval processes of the reports, and then provide some of the key findings from the most recent publication from the sixth assessment cycle, which is the synthesis report that was approved in March. And there'll be ample time for questions and answers. So we look forward to your engagement with these panelists. You can put questions in the chat. Michael Camp will collect them, and I'll ask people questions after we go through about 10 minutes each from each of the three speakers. Let me just mention that this webinar is part of a really exciting collaboration that was initiated 2 years ago by Wes Fell. Wes was involved in the founding of IIASA nearly 50 years ago, and also in the founding of the Energy Analysis and Policy Program at the University of Wisconsin 40 years ago. And thanks to Wes's generosity, we've been able to help fund collaborative activities like this one. We have multiple projects and researchers from each institution visiting the other. And for me, it's really been a pleasure to work with Shonali and Layla and others at IIASA in Laxenburg, and also to have visitors here in Madison. I'm looking forward to more of our joint work into involving more researchers in the collaboration. Thanks also to Michael Camp at the University of Wisconsin's Energy Analysis and Policy Program, who helped organize this session. So let me first introduce our speakers. So first is Shonali Kochuri. She's at the ECE program, and she's the leader of the Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group in the Energy, Climate, and Environment program at IIASA. Her research explores the role of social, institutional, and technological innovations for inclusive human development, particularly for populations without access to basic infrastructure and services. She served as a lead author in Working Group 3 for the IPCC Climate Report, and also most recently as a member of the extended writing team on the synthesis report that I mentioned was approved just in March. Thank you, Shonali, for joining us. And then we also have Layla Niamir, who's a research scholar in the Energy, Climate, and Environment program at IIASA. She's a computational economist working on energy and climate change mitigation. Her research focuses on energy demand, behavioral and lifestyle changes, social and cultural transformation, and well-being. And she served as a lead author in Working Group 3 on the 2022 Climate Report, and is a contributing author in the synthesis report that was completed in March. So thanks to Shonali and Layla. And I'm Greg Nemeth, professor of public affairs at UW-Madison. I work on low carbon innovation and work on multiple projects at IIASA as well. So the format, as I said, is each speaker will do 10 minutes each. Put your questions in the chat. We'll collect them and ask them of the panelists at the end. And I'll turn it over now to Layla to start us on describing what the IPCC does.
Thank you so much, Greg, and hello, everyone. I first share my screen, and then I'll continue. So thanks a lot for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I had a real privilege to be part of this IPCC, basically, procedure as a kind of young researcher. So what I'm going to provide in these slides actually is that the little bit I'm talking about what's the actually background of the IPCC, what's the history of the IPCC, what's the structure, and what's the process, because actually this is one of the photos that I was involved the first day at the IPCC, and this is the last one when we approved a synthesis report. So we had a long journey, and I would love to share that with you all. So I will start with the history of the IPCC. Basically, IPCC started in 1988 as a first time, and then they had several reports till now, many of them as basically main synthesis report, and there are lots of special reports comes up, and then in the highlights, actually, it was a Nobel Prize that they got it in 2007, and then also last year another prize for biodiversity and climate. So it was a very, very long journey till we are now here, and we are approaching for COP28. So here, actually, I really want to emphasize on what's the role of the IPCC. Basically, what IPCC do is that comprehensively assess all the scientific and technical and socio-economical information that is related to the human-induced climate change in general, and potential impact and options for adaptation and mitigation. So it's purely scientific basis. And then also IPCC report should be neutral with respect of the policy, and that's why they are inviting from all over the world, from the different countries, to be nominated as authors, and then also in the procedure of the approval and the review. So how is basically the structure of the IPCC look like? Basically, IPCC, it's between science and policy. They have three main working groups that brings the three main reports. Is working group 1 that emphasize on a physical and physical science basis. Working group 2 which talks about more adaptation, impacts, and vulnerability, and working group 3 which is focusing on a mitigation perspective. So for each of these working group, the main assessment, the main report, they assess and the main report will come out. And then basically in between also we have some special reports. In this perspective, from the policy side, we have lots of governments that basically is around 200 member of the states are appointed as a national focal points. And then I will tell in a later stages that how they can nominate the authors, and then how the authors team shapes, and then how they are going through the procedure of writing the report. And from the science, there's hundreds of scientists from all over the world also involved in this process as an author, and scientists as a review editors, and also as expert reviews, or the people who are going to review the draft of the IPCC. So the procedure basically is a really, really long procedure, starting from the scoping the main points that they would like to cover through each working group and in each cycle. Basically, for example, the last one is a 6th cycle of the IPCC, and then goes through all the procedure till they ended up to the publication and reach out. So I divide this in 3 steps that I'm going to show as follow. Started with the preparatory things, which is actually start with scoping the report. I mean, what type of the topics they would like to discuss, what type of the each chapter, what type of the topic is important to discuss, and this is something that is drafted by experts, and then which is nominated by the government and observed organizations. And then they have an approval session of the outline, and as soon as the outline is approved, the selection for the authors will start. There usually is that the governments and observer organization nominate the experts and scientists for the cycle of the IPCC and the particular working groups, and then the selection committee or the selection of the authors will start through the side of the IPCC Bureau and Secretary. As soon as then they have the whole author team and then set up the chair and co-chairs, then the drafting procedure will start. First, actually, in this figure, it shows basically the 3 steps. There were 3 steps as the basically first order draft and second order draft and final order draft. But I would like to say that something that is here is missing, that is not showing, is at 0 order draft. Basically, first of all, we as a team of the chapters that are working on different topics, we start the drafting outline. I mean, outlines. We had the drafting, the very, very primary draft, and then sharing between us as a different team of the members to review. But the fourth or the first order draft is the first draft that goes out for the expert reviews, and then people could register and be experts to review this draft. And then the same procedure goes for a second order draft, and the difference here is that we also meanwhile preparing the summary for policymakers, which I'm going to talk about the summary for policymakers in a bit. And then also goes to the final draft, and then till reach to the government review to go to the approval session. And for the approval, that basically is a plenary that always goes to the plenary that Shonali going to talk about this more. And then as soon as this approved, there's a release of the report, and then the information goes through the media, and then we have lots of outreach activity. For example, this webinar is also count as one of the outreach activity that we try to reach out to the whole audience of this report, which would be the whole society basically. The IPCC reports we had a different type of basically reports. So far, there's a 6 assessment reports, basically six cycle of the report happened, 14 special reports that we had, and 9 guidelines for the national perspective, and 6 technical papers. Let's focus on, for example, the latest assessment, which is a 6th assessment report that, as I described, all working group, basically 3 working group has their own report, which is first one is a physical science, and then adaptation, and the mitigation. And meanwhile, that these 3 working groups working hardly on their report, that each of them takes around 3 to 4 years. But for example, for this round, it takes longer because also we come back the COVID situation. There's also 3 special reports that published in this cycle, from the ocean to the climate and land, and then 1.5 degree. And at the end, which actually we just finalized it and then released in March, it was a synthesis report, which actually synthesis report going to synthesize all these reports that published. Each of these reports is around 1,000 of the pages, so that's why it's needed to be a very summary. In other point, actually, I just wanted to say, in each of these working group 1 and 2 and 3 has a different type of the summaries or the full report. I mean, of course, we have a full report as a whole chapters, but also they are publishing the technical summary, which is provide the extended summary of the key findings linked between assessment and working group SPMs, and then full report, so it's standing in the middle. And then we have a summary for policymakers that is provide a high level summary or key findings that it would be useful for governments. And that's why this is something that we are going to approve in an approval session line by line. But how we can involve in IPCC in a general, basically, there's I can say it in 3 ways that we can be involved. First of all, which I think is a very, very important, is that contribution to the literature. I mean, producing knowledge, and then literature for that. And then you can be as an author or review editors that could be nominated throughout the focal points or the national or governments. And then also you can be as expert review, to be involved in a review of, as I mentioned, there's a two round of the review happening, the first order draft and then second order draft, and then chip into the synthesis or the assessment of the IPCC by putting your comments on that. So I will stop here, and then if you need more information, you can check the IPCC website and then also follow up the Twitter, or you can always contact us for more information. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, Leila. And I'll just, before turning over to Shonali, I'll just talk a little bit about one of the steps that Leila mentioned in her process diagram is the approval process. And I'll talk about it from the perspective of the Working Group 3 report that was approved about a year ago. And then I'll turn it over to Shonali to talk about some of the key outcomes, but also about the approval process for the synthesis report, which only just happened about a month ago. So yeah, my basic take on the approval process is that I came away very encouraged by the process. And I didn't feel that in the middle of the process or 2/3 of the way through the approval process. But after I did, so I can say why in just a minute. But yeah, just to pick up on where Layla came from, part of the process here is when we're building the report, writing the report, is responding to review comments. And I think we had a number of 60,000 review comments on the third assessment or the sixth assessment report on working group 3. And so not all of them require changing the text, but they all required taking a read and saying whether it's relevant and something we need to fix. And that was a pretty substantial effort. So thinking about feedback and ways to participate, those review comments really do get taken seriously. So that was a project. And then part of building the report then is to publish a summary document, the summary for policymakers. And that also gets review comments, and it gets comments from governments and other people that provide input on it. And similarly, we have to respond to the comments and make adjustments to the text where needed. But the one big difference that's distinct about the summary for policymakers is that it has to get approved by all 193 UN governments. And that is why it's not the International Panel on Climate Change, a bunch of climate scientists. It's intergovernmental because the governments approved the document. And maybe in the Q&A or in a minute, I can mention some of the pros and cons of having governments involved, but they're intimately involved in a way more intimate way than reviewer comments on the report are, because they approve the document on a line-by-line basis. So there are extended discussions about a few words, individual words that can take 4 hours to whether or not an individual meaningful word gets included. So yeah, that was a big part of the process. So just to provide a little bit more color on it. So in terms of the working group 3 summary for policymakers approval process, that usually the UN dedicates 1 week to that process, but because that was still online, so the process that Shonali just completed was in person, but because a year ago it was still online, we allocated 2 weeks to approve the text, and it was about a 9,000 word summary. And we know from the past that the approval proceeds at about 150 words per minute is what someone can speak. But in terms of UN process, 150 words per hour gets approved. So you can do the math and figure out how many hours that involves. And a lot of that approval happened in the very end, and actually after the end. So I'm pretty sure that 2 weeks was supposed to end on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. And by Friday night, at the end of 2 weeks, only a third of the summary had been approved. And a lot of the 2/3 that hadn't been approved included the most contentious issues, and progress was stalled. And I was at IIASA in Vienna for that approval process, and there were celebrations planned for Saturday and Sunday that had to be canceled and postponed because that was a dark weekend. And there was even contingency planning made for maybe the summary won't get approved because it just was, there were so many sticky issues. But it was one of the most, it was pretty frustrating experience in a lot of ways. But I think in the end, I came away very encouraged by it because in the middle of that process, it really felt like the country representatives had all the power because they had a veto power. They could always decide not to approve a line. They could hold up discussions for hours, and often they did, and send discussions deep into the night. Like for the last 40 hours were done almost continuously of that approval process. And all it would take would be a country to withdraw from approving. And so it really felt like, how could scientists be in a position to overcome that type of possible recalcitrance? But as it turned out, there were a lot of countries that weren't acting that way, that were constructively engaged in trying to get the process to happen. And so that was really important. But also, like, the discussions that happen, they ultimately have to be on the merits of the science. And even if countries disapprove of something that's written, maybe because they don't like it politically, or there's some self-interest or economic self-interest, they still have to say why they disagree with it. And just that requirement to use the word because opened up discussion and gave a chance for other countries that might see the the clear scientific merits of whatever claim we were making, come to the discussion as well. So it was a long process, but ultimately, most of what we really wanted to say, we said, like in terms of what the draft said before the approval process, before 2 weeks, and what it said after. And then at least for the parts that I worked on personally, I think a lot of them came out clearer and sometimes with more detail, because they went through this really rigorous process of working with the governments to make sure that what was said was clear. And there were implications of governments approving it that's different from the rest of the report, because at the end, when you have this approved summary for policymakers, it's not a summary for other scientists. It's a summary for policymakers. And so because it's been not just approved by lots of scientists, but it's been approved by 193 UN governments, a staffer working in the environmental ministry can bring some part of the report to their minister and say, this has been approved by all 193 governments, and it says that we need to reduce fossil fuels, or we need to limit emissions, or if we want to meet the Paris targets, we need to do this or that. And it's because it's been through that rigorous process. So I came away pretty encouraged by it. I teach policy analysis, and it's now one of the motivational examples I give for students about why policy analysis matters, why the science can actually inform the policy process, even if there's strong interest opposed to a particular course of action. There really are. This is a venue where the scientific process really has this privileged position, and it's important, I think, to protect it and continue with it. So that's my experience from working group 3, but I'll turn it over to Shanali now to talk about the higher level, which is the summary or the synthesis report and the summary she did there.
Thanks very much, Greg. Thanks also, Michael, for helping to organize this. And of course, many thanks to Wes for giving us this opportunity to have more collaboration between University of Wisconsin-Madison and IIASA. So yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope that I don't make this too long. I have agreed to say a little bit both about the process in terms of the approval, really, but then I will keep that brief and focus mainly on some of the key findings from the synthesis report, which came out last month. I think one thing to start with is that, of course, the summary for policymakers from all the reports kind of is the most visible aspect of the reports in some sense, because this is the part of the report that is approved line by line by all the UN government signatories, and so this is what then also gets a lot of attention in the press and media and outreach. But of course, this is kind of like a tip of the iceberg in a sense, because as Leila very nicely described in her presentation, the IPCC assessment process is a much longer one, where basically we're assessing evidence of the existing science over the course of 3 to 5 years, and we're looking at the most recent advancements in the science over the last 5 years, 10 years. And it's really a huge collective exercise where basically there's a whole process of reviewing the first order draft, the second order draft, and it's a huge community effort and activity that really takes place. And because it's a volunteer activity, all the scientists are volunteers in this process, nobody gets paid for this job. It's sort of something that we all do on our weekends and off days and evenings and nights. So just to say a little bit about the process that took place in Interlaken. So this was the first in-person plenary that took place in many years. So since 2018, 2019, there hadn't been an in-person plenary. was officially meant to be 5 days. The agenda was 5 days, but then it was extended by 2 days. And like with the Working Group 3 plenary, there were long negotiating day and night sessions. So in the last 48 hours, I think we had 1 hour of sleep, if at all. So it was pretty intense. And then, increasingly, there's this tension, that growing tension really between sort of maintaining the scientific accuracy of the assessment and at the same time sort of engaging with policymakers and trying to address the policy needs of the policymakers. And actually there's now kind of, I think, a growing tension because the established IPCC model is very focused on a global scientific assessment. And it's meant to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But from governments, there's an increasing call for providing inputs on how to do implementation of climate protection, adaptation, and financing. And this, of course, has national sensitivities associated with it. And this, I think, is something that was increasingly playing out also at the approval session in Interlaken. So just to give you a very short overview of what this synthesis report is meant to be, it's basically two things that one has to keep in mind. One is that it's not doing any new assessment. The synthesis report is basically a synthesis of all the existing reports in the cycle. So as Leila mentioned, there are 3 working group reports in the AR6 cycle, and then there were 3 special reports in the AR6 cycle. So it's basically an assessment of all the assessments, a synthesis of all the assessments rather. And so while it doesn't include anything new, it is very important because it really shapes the narrative and is often the most politically influential product of the IPCC. And why this particular report is important for policy is, again, for 2 reasons. One is it's going to be a key resource for the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So what the global stocktake is aiming to do is to evaluate the progress of what the world has done so far to slash greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, it's sort of trying to look at what's happened in terms of the ambition level of the nationally determined contributions and also their implementation. So the global stock place will really inform how the ambition will be scaled up in 2025. And this is a process that started already in 2021 in Glasgow, and it will be concluded this year at the COP28 in the UAE. And the global stocktake will sort of focus on mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. So it can really end up being a reference for the global adaptation goal, the global finance targets, and the new financial mechanisms for loss and damage. So coming now to some of the key findings of the synthesis report, I mean, one of the key, big takeaways from the report is that actually we have already contributed, human activities have already contributed to 1.1 degrees Celsius global warming in this decade compared to pre-industrial times. And so, basically this is through the emissions of greenhouse gases, and it's unequivocal that we have caused global warming of this amount. And basically, if we look at how greenhouse gas emissions have increased over time, we are seeing that it's been unequal regionally, but there have been increasing unsustainable energy use, land use and land use change, lifestyles and patterns of consumption and production that have all contributed to increasing emissions. And over the period 2010 to 2019, which is the last decade, actually average annual emissions were higher than in any other previous decade on record. even though the rate of growth of emissions in the last decade has been a bit lower than previously. And so what we see again is that formal detection and attribution studies that synthesize information from the climate models really show that almost all the warming that is observed between 1850 and 1900 and 2010, 2019 is really caused by human activity. And basically the global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over the last 2000 years. So, I mean, I think this findings in terms of the science is even stronger than in the previous assessment reports. So the other thing that the report very clearly highlights is that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes, and this is in every region across the globe. So we can see evidence of observed changes in extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, tropical cyclones, and so on. And this is all can be attributed to human influence. And the attribution to human influence has actually strengthened since the last assessment report. So this figure really shows one example, which is the effect on agricultural and ecological droughts. And the squares or the hexagons are really regions. And then the colors depict the observed change since the 1950s. And what we see is that there's really been large increases. And this is already something that we can see happening today and has happened over the last couple of decades. Now, if we look at the historical contributions of CO2 emissions, these vary substantially across regions. So on the leftmost part of this graph, we can see that the total magnitude of CO2 emissions varies substantially across regions if we look at the historical contributions. But this is both in terms of the total, but also in terms of the contributions of the fossil fuel and industrial CO2 emissions and the CO2 emissions from land use change and forestry. But then there are also large differences in GHG emissions evident today. So if we look at the second graph, which is the GHG emissions in 2019, we see that there are huge differences across regions where you see the per capita on the x-axis and the population on the y-axis. And basically, we see that today about 35% of the population lives in countries emitting more than 9 tons of CO2 per capita, but then about 2/5 of the population live in countries emitting less than 3 tons of CO2 per capita. So there are vast differences in how much different regions have contributed to the problem and how these emissions are distributed currently as well. More importantly, what we see is also that in this figure, you see the average level of vulnerability amongst a country's population against CO2 emissions per capita. And across sectors and regions, basically, it's the most vulnerable people and systems that are disproportionately affected. So basically, countries that have contributed historically least to the current climate problem are actually being affected the most. So there's quite a lot of inequity in how this is playing out. In terms of adverse impacts of human-caused climate change, these will continue to intensify. So basically, we've seen already that climate change has caused widespread impacts related to loss and damage to nature and people, that these are unequally distributed across systems, regions, and sectors. But then basically what we are also seeing is that there will be increasing weather and climate extremes and more people exposed to impacts such as food insecurity, reduced water security, and so on. And that these are very diverse across regions. One of the iconic figures of the synthesis report is this one, the one that I'm showing now. And it really illustrates that we have already changed the climate. And basically that it shows the lifespans of 3 representative generations born in 1950, 1980, and 2020. And what is clear from this figure is that even if we cut all emissions today and limit global heating to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in line with the Paris Agreement, we are leaving our children with a much hotter world than what we inherited. And I think that's a quite powerful takeaway. In addition, the synthesis report also highlights that the risk of projected adverse impacts and losses and damages from climate change will be escalating with every increment of global warming. So every even fraction of a degree of warming that we contribute will further intensify the impacts in terms of both the natural and the human impacts. And the proportion of land experiencing different extremes and different weather anomalies will increase over time. So this is just an example of how the wettest day precipitation changes over time on a global scale, and showing regional differences for different future temperatures. And then what this also means is that the impacts on human well-being will increase. So this is again an example of food production. So climate-driven food production impacts will exacerbate over time across regions. And of course, with every increment of warming, this gets worse. But then also, the climate-driven impacts interact with non-climate impacts as well, such as urban expansion and so on and so forth. And that means that the vulnerabilities will differ across regions. So basically, we've seen progress in terms of both mitigation and adaptation action over the last couple of decades. But despite the progress, there are big gaps. And basically, what this graph shows you is that the global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 associated with implementation of the nationally determined contributions announced prior to COP26 make it very likely that we will exceed the 1.5 degree target during the 21st century, and that it will become much harder to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius if no additional commitments are made or actions are taken. So there's a substantial emissions gap that we see here. And that basically what we are seeing is that, in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which is what is the goal of the Paris Agreement, we need to have emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions decline by 43% by the early 2030s relative to 2019, and CO2 emissions to reach net zero by mid-century. And of course, what we're seeing with what's now in the indices, that's far from what needs to happen. Of course, insufficient financing and lack of political frameworks to incentivize finance are key causes of these implementation gaps, both for mitigation and adaptation. What we've seen is that financial flows remain heavily focused on mitigation, but they are very uneven across regions, across sectors. Public and private finance for fossil fuels are still greater than those for climate adaptation and mitigation. And if we look at the tracked finance of climate finance over the last couple of decades, most of it is directed towards mitigation action. There's very little on adaptation. So the adaptation finance gaps are even larger than for mitigation. But basically, finance really needs to step up in order to make this possible. I'll speed up a bit because I know I've taken more time than I should, but I just want to end with some signs of hope. So basically, though it's all doom and gloom in a sense, there is a huge opportunity for scaling up climate action. Many mitigation and adaptation actions have multiple synergies with sustainable development goals. And this graph really shows you how near-term adaptation and mitigation actions have more synergies than trade-offs. And where trade-offs exist, there are policies that can be made, put in place that can kind of ameliorate these trade-offs, can minimize these trade-offs, and that's sort of a big sign of hope. We've also seen that multiple low-carbon electricity generation storage technologies are becoming increasingly competitive with fossil-based systems. So we've seen big drops in costs, big scale-up in deployment, and this, of course, is very encouraging. In some regions, it's more expensive now to maintain emission-intensive systems than to transition to low-emission systems. So this is very encouraging. And also, there are multiple opportunities to scale up climate action. So here is a graph that kind of really shows you a figure of how various adaptation actions are, their feasibility and their potential synergies with mitigation actions. And then the right-hand side provides an overview of selected mitigation options and their estimated costs and potentials in 2030. And what's very clear from this figure is that there are many actions where the costs are very low. These are the blue and yellow parts of the bars, and that these can deliver significant emissions reductions till 2030. This additional figure shows how demand-side mitigation options can also be a huge opportunity for finding new ways for end-use service provision that reduce emissions in end-use sectors. And this is across buildings, land, transport, and food. Of course, currently emissions are very unequal, as I mentioned, so there will be some regions and socioeconomic groups where emissions and energy will have to increase. There are these existing inequities that we have to keep mind of, but there is a huge potential on the demand side as well. So just to end, I think one of the main messages from the synthesis report is that our choices in this decade will determine the future. I think that's the key point, and that we have to have deep, rapid, and sustained climate action. This requires unprecedented transformations. We need transitions across all sectors and systems. We need to keep equity in the forefront in designing transitions that are just. And there are huge opportunities for climate resilient development. That's resilient. That means basically integrating adaptation and mitigation and making that also speak to sustainable development across regions. And this really requires a scaling up of finance, more political commitment, multi-level governance, and appropriate institutional frameworks, laws, policies, and strategies. So with that, I'll end, and thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen as well so we can have more of a Q&A and discussion.
Thanks so much, Shanali. That was, I guess it's impressive for your group to have condensed 5 years of work and thousands of pages of reports into a 40-page or so summary. But to me, it's even more impressive to get a 15-minute version of it that you just did. So that was really something, and a lot to convey there. So I'll pick up questions in the chat. Maybe one I'll just start with, because it kind of came through in your last few slides, is you're talking about taking the science and it's meant to be for policymakers. And you said there's some idea that there maybe should be more about implementation and more direction about it. But could you say anything about what the theory of change is for communicating science to policymakers? Because some of your slides, the theory seemed to be alarmists talk about how bad the situation is to catalyze action. And then the last few slides, it was more about, well, here are some avenues that seem to be promising. What do you have a sense or a personal take on how these types of messages get received by different types of policymakers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg. And I think there was a lot of discussion amongst the authors and then also with the science communication team on how we should really package the information and communicate the information. And I mean, of course, there are diverse views on how one should do this, but in general, I think eventually we kind of converged on this idea that we really do need to emphasize how the science is even more conclusive in firstly attributing climate change to human activity, and then also that it is a bit alarming because the risks and the impacts are even more strong in a sense than what the last assessment cycle showed. So, you know, all of this is quite alarming, and I think it has to be communicated because it's only through understanding this that you can maybe get policymakers to act more more than they are at the moment. But then at the same time, it's equally important to show how one can do this. And that's where, you know, the last few slides really were trying to speak to that, to say there are huge opportunities. It's not as if, you know, our window has closed yet. There's a lot that can be done. There's a lot that can be scaled up. And we have the means to do that, actually. We already have that. And so I think it's a difficult balance, but I think that's sort of what we tried to get at. And I think that's, yeah. I'll stop at that.
I mean, that balance came through in the slides that you just presented. So that was a really good example. I'm going to ask a question to Leila, and then if Wes has a question, maybe I'll turn to you, Wes, after asking to Leila. So Leila, we had one question from Scott Williams. Can you talk about the process of creating and approving graphics for these reports? I thought this is a good one for you because you've been very deeply involved in several of the really important graphics, especially some of the really creative and novel ones. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about the process of graphics. I think as Scott, the implication of Scott's question is that gets a lot of attention. So yeah, turn it to you for that.
Thanks for the question. Actually, it's very, very important since also myself believe that one graph could talk about more than 1,000 of the word. And that's very important, that how we are coming to reach to this figure. I'm just bringing one example that, for example, in our chapter that we were working on the demand side options for climate change mitigation, collaboratively between our team, we're thinking about that, what type of the figures that could bring a key message of this chapter, basically. So we had runs and runs and runs of the discussion, brainstorming, sketching, and actually I was, as Greg mentioned, I was involved from the beginning to sketching this figure, and then it changed from the beginning to the end. So it was a really hard work. It's just a really cooperative between all the authors, and then went through the several review process, not only within the IPCC authors, but also for the broader perspective of the expert reviews several times. And then the good things is that always we have a graphic designers who are supporting us perfectly, and actually it's their art. We try to sketch it in our perspective, but they are helping us that how we can make it more understandable and bring the message out. So I would say it is a really strong collaboration between scientists, team of scientists, but also graphic designers to come out of that. And again, the same procedure happened for synthesis report. That was more challenging because again, we are synthesizing all the basically aspects of the 3 working groups. But yeah, I mean, if I want to say it in a summary, it's a really collaborative perspective, and then from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, great, Leila. Thanks for that description. Boy, those graphics, especially the ones in the summary, policymakers will get used for years. So that work is worthwhile. I just, as a question I want to get to in the chat, but also I noticed that Wes is on it. I wanted to see, Wes, if you had any comments or reflections or questions you wanted to add while you're here.
Thanks, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, great that you, since we have a lot of people, it would appear on talk that some of them are not in the middle of the science and the workings of the the IPCC. I think it's great that you spend a reasonable amount of time on the process, and that people can really gain from seeing how much scientific work went into this. And that's really important. I think many of us, I'll have to admit, even myself, don't, in this case, and also I'm fairly close to the field, don't realize the extent of the scientific input that goes into this. So that was very useful to see that whole process, and I think helps build some confidence in the science, even though science is under quite a bit of attack these days. I had a question. I've heard some discussion about this loss and damage issue, where for the first time the report or the deliberations gave some hope or some belief in the feasibility of the wealthier countries providing some compensation for damage, or providing some technology to the developing economies, who, as Shonali pointed out, seem to be the most susceptible to damage. And I wonder if you could, one of you or both of you or all of you, could comment on that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I can try to start doing that. I mean, this is not really my area of expertise, but I can say what I know from the synthesis process. So, loss and damage is, of course, a big issue now and will be increasingly covered by the COPs, has been put on the agenda for the COPs as well. And so the idea there really being, of course, a lot of the loss and damage that we've observed and that is occurring is as I mentioned, in regions of the world which haven't really contributed to the problem as much. So that's one thing. And then they also tend to be regions of the world where, they're least developed, their governance capacity and their financing capacity is rather low. So the idea being that through international cooperation and through financial flows, there could be a way to really enhance both mitigation and adaptation action in these regions that require it the most, and link it to sort of, in some way, loss and damages that have occurred. So, I think this is a very evolving space. There are more questions than answers on how this will be done at this point in time. But what the synthesis report did help to do is to highlight the extent of the loss and damages across different regions and populations as they've already occurred, and how these might get worse over time if mitigation action doesn't get more ambitious in the near term. So I think that's an imperfect answer to your question, Wes, but maybe says a little bit more than what you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Wes, and thanks, Shonali, for that response. I'm going to pick up another question here from Sonia Da Vega. Could the fact that policies and investment are presently more focused on mitigation than adaptation be because of political resistance to realize the need for quick action and present investment for future generations without present political benefit, plus the belief that some technological breakthrough will save us? If so, does if you believe the next IPCC could in some way redirect the focus of policymakers to the need of present action? Yeah, I guess I would respond to that a little bit. I think a lot of we've talked a fair amount about Working Group 3 on mitigation because we were all deeply involved in that. But there's the second working group that's talking about impacts and vulnerability, talks about the damages that Shonali represented, but also about some of the solutions and sometimes called adaptation. So yeah, that is in there as well. I think I don't think that's an issue where there's science that's missing on adaptation, because we do have a whole second working group focused on the impacts and then how to adapt to them. But it's probably more a question of the policy domain, in which that is a place where, for example, the funding for investment in developing countries to deal with adaptation and mitigation to some extent too, that was agreed on, $100 million a year agreed on in the Paris Agreement. It looks like maybe a quarter of that has actually happened, a lot of it from Japan, but a lot of countries have not participated in that. So I think that's probably an area where policy needs to get more active, but I don't think the reason for that is that we're missing the science and information from the IPCC on that one. So yeah, good question on that one. But the other thing, maybe I'll turn to Leila for another response to Sonia's question, is this need for near-term action. And I think one of the really innovative aspects of the sixth assessment report was to have a chapter on dealing with reducing demand for energy, and not just about shiny new things and novel technologies that get a lot of attention, but a much broader set. And maybe I'll turn it over to you, Leila, for some of the activity that occurred in that chapter that you were heavily involved in.
Sure. Actually, it's really important to say that from the beginning we are emphasizing, and this is really collaboration between different disciplines. It's really, we are coming from the different backgrounds, and this was in a sixth cycle of the IPCC. It was the first time that it was a dedicated chapter on social and behavioral aspects, and majority of the authors that involved in this chapter coming from the social sciences, psychology, sociology, and this helps actually combination of the different expertise to bring this kind of new interventions coming from the demand side and bottom-up approaches, that how behavior change and lifestyle changes and how social movements could influence on reduction of the greenhouse gas emission. So this was a new initiative and a very well received by governments, and it's not, we are not saying this is all on the shoulder of the people. No, this is something that we do need a multiple governance from the each individual through the policymakers. But this is something that helps that every individual actions now matter for a future, and we are hoping that for a next cycle we can have more information and more literature to talk about this. And that's why all of our contribution in science helps, because this helps for us also to synthesize that or to our assessments and bring more knowledge to policymakers.
Great, thanks, Leila. And let me see, there's one question here from Ashok that I'll just read it, and I think it's our time for our last question. Some of us practitioners working in the field of climate change, clean energy, and financing are often disconnected from the IPCC process, but we rely on strategic platforms. Now that a 2-degree future seems inevitable and just a matter of time, adaptation and mitigation need to be looked at in par when it comes to policy. It would be good to know what are the direct or indirect ways that the sixth assessment reports influence the country strategic plans that emerge through NDCs or NDC updates. So Shanali or Leila, do any of you want to comment on how we know whether these reports actually get used in the UNFCCC process, which is technically the reason why the IPCC exists?
Yeah, I can try to address that one. So as I mentioned right at the very start of my presentation, actually, the synthesis report directly feeds into the global stock take for the Paris Agreement. So the global stock take started in 2021, will conclude this year at the COP in UAE, is really an effort to try to look at how existing NDCs are helping achieve the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, or how far off is the, how big is the emissions gap and the implementation gap. And so basically the findings of the synthesis report, and one of the graphs that I showed within my presentation as well, really shows you the size of that gap. And that's meant to really then inform, basically how NDCs need to be scaled up, how the ambition level for the NDCs need to be scaled up in order to achieve the Paris Agreement. And so it's really how the findings of the synthesis report, both in terms of the adaptation gaps, but also the mitigation gaps and the finance gaps, that will help with the global stocktake that occurs at the COP, and then will help further inform countries in terms of how much they have to scale up ambition on mitigation, on adaptation, on the means of financing, and so on. So yeah, I think there's really a direct link there in terms of what the IPCC is doing, and then basically how that should feed into the whole policy process.
Great. Thank you, Shonali. And I'll look forward to following that, engaging with that process as we look forward to this important stocktake and then next round of commitments after that. So thank you to our speakers, to Shonali and Leila. Thank you to Westphal for supporting this collaboration. And I look forward to more collaboration and spending time in each of the institutions and having visitors come to Wisconsin, and really thankful to Wes for all that, and thankful to all of you for joining us today and for your questions that led to an interesting discussion. We'll look forward. We'll be doing more of these. Probably next time will be early in the fall, and we'll be in touch soon. So thanks all for joining today.